He spent his early years in the South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. The only president to earn a Ph.D., he taught at several schools before becoming president of Princeton University. He was elected governor of New Jersey and broke with party bosses to support progressive reforms. Just 2 years later, he received the Democratic nomination for the presidency and won against President Taft and former President Roosevelt. In his first term, he lowered tariffs, implemented a federal income tax, and presided over the creation of the Federal Reserve. He prevailed in a close re-election bid with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." However, the following year, the U.S. entered the First World War. After the armistice was signed, he met with other Allied leaders and supported the creation of the League of Nations, undertaking a tour of the country to promote his vision for peace. He became ill and was incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. He retired to a house in Washington and was buried at the National Cathedral when he died a few years later. He is our nation's 28th chief executive, Woodrow Wilson. Let's take a look on a map at some sites associated with Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister, and they spent a lot of time moving around in his childhood within the South. He was born in Stanton, Virginia, right there. Today you can see the house there where he was born. He did stay in that house one night as president-elect in 1912. He was the first president born in the South since Andrew Johnson, so there were 9 presidents in between them. Another site where he lived during his childhood is Augusta, Georgia, and at that location you can see right next to the Presbyterian Church there is the house where they lived that you can go and tour. That's where they lived during the Civil War as Wilson was growing up. His family did support the Confederacy during the war. The third site is in Columbia, South Carolina. They lived there in the 1870s, and that's another house that you can go and visit. Now, Wilson was the only president to earn a Ph.D. He became president of Princeton University in New Jersey, and he was then elected governor of New Jersey in 1910, and just 2 years later, he was elected president. After his presidency, he lived in a house in Washington, D.C., and you can go and tour that house. He lived there from his retirement from the presidency in 1921 until his death in 1924, and he's buried in Washington at Washington National Cathedral. Now let's take a look at some photographs of these sites. Now let's take a look at some books in my library relating to Woodrow Wilson. I have 2 good recent biographies of Wilson. Both of them cover Wilson's entire life and spend some time on his academic career, particularly his time as president of Princeton University, which really prepared him for his life in politics. And certainly they cover his presidency, the progressive reform movement, the First World War, and the aftermath of the First World War and the push for the League of Nations. The first biography is by John Milton Cooper Jr. It was published in 2009, and it's called Woodrow Wilson, a Biography. And the second was published in 2013. It's by A. Scott Berg, and it's called Wilson. This is a nice booklet from the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum in Stanton, Virginia. It has some nice photographs and other information from the site of Wilson's birth. A very good book about a very consequential election in American history is 1912, Wilson, Roosevelt, Taft, and Debs, the election that changed the country, by James Chase. It was published in 2004. This is a small booklet published in 1963 on the status revolution and the progressive movement. This book is from a British publisher, but it's a good overview of World War I. It's simply called World War I, An Illustrated History. It was published in 2001. And another booklet by Ernest May called The Coming of War, 1917. It's a good brief treatment of the issues which led to the First World War and the U.S. involvement in the war, including the sinking of the Lusitania, things like that. Well, the other thing that happened during the Wilson administration is the passage of the 19th Amendment, and it was actually ratified by Tennessee. Was the last state to vote to ratify it in August of 1920. This is the story of that told from the perspective of three different women, two who supported ratification and one who didn't. And it's called The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote by Elaine Weiss, and it was published in 2018. Of course, it did pass. All eyes were on Nashville that summer. The amendment did pass, and women were permitted to vote in every state for the first time in the presidential election of 1920. Our next program will feature our nation's 29th president, Warren G. Harding.